Hello. That was supposed to be a fade. Jeez. Hello and welcome to Dr. K's Psychobabble. Today we are going to be taking on part 2 of my little series here on intelligence, taking a look at the IQ and where that came from, and then some very interesting terminology that we have in the history of psychology to describe individuals with cognitive and intellectual disabilities, the terms that we use today. These are ever-evolving terms, so I'm going to try and place these in context of history. And so where we left off on part 1 was we had talked about factor analysis, looking at measures of cognitive abilities, looking at people who are similar, defining what intelligence is based on a characteristic that people have called G, that, people, some have a lot of it, some have a little bit of it. And then it looks at, how are all these intelligent people the same? And then there's kind of a shift, and we're going to see this sort of realized in the way that social policy began to take a role in determining the direction of psychological research. We look at what makes us different, and this kind of birthed the notion of the psychology of individual differences, being able to compare people. It's not just a matter of whether you are intelligent or not, is how intelligent are you compared to your peers, compared to people older than you, younger than you, those kinds of things. And you can see that slight shift. So what happened was in the nation of France in 1905, the French government was wondering how to determine which children in their school system needed special education. So you have children entering the school system and also people existing in the school system. Some are being successful, some are not. And they needed a test. They needed a test to determine where people are at and kind of draw some lines in the sand as to who needs to get special education, and maybe the invention of remedial education to see if we can get those individuals caught up with their age mates and what's not. And they turned to a gentleman by the name of Alfred Binet and his co-researcher Theodore Simon. Now, Alfred Binet decided that he was going to take a look at this concept of intelligence, a little bit different than what's been going on up until now. He talked about mental abilities, but he was really focusing on generic types of abilities, sort of like the building blocks of what we might use for carrying out activities so that we could be successful. These included things like memory capacity and attention span. And we're really starting to see some of the nuances of modern day intelligence testing coming in. We're not necessarily looking at intelligence from a what did you produce, like degrees or money or anything like that. We know that those are measures of intelligence, but this is really kind of breaking down the mental abilities that individuals have that they can then apply to any circumstances they're in. And in this case, and this is very important to recognize, in this case, who's going to do well within the structure of the French school system, the curriculum? So keep in mind, this is going to come up in the next video when I talk about the limitations of the IQ and why we needed something else, but why IQ is still important because of its relationship to predicting how well we're going to do in school, specifically that environment. So what Alfred Binet did, created tests for all kinds of different age kids, and he conceived of the concept of mental age. Now, mental age would be the normative, normally expected level of memory, processing, problem solving that we would see at a particular age. So a person with a mental age of 5 is able to do the kinds of mental abilities and skills that the average 5-year-old can do. So rather than just looking at chronological age, he actually created a way to measure, well, where is somebody in terms of their mental age? And that gave him the opportunity to do some comparison between individuals that might score differently on his tests. So he took this notion of mental age, and let's say we have a person here, and this individual has a chronological age of 5. Now, this person takes Binet's test, and the scaling of the test reveals that this individual scored actually like the average 2-year-old. So they're not scoring in line with their same age peers, they're scoring below that. So here we see the distinction that Binet creates in the first IQ, or leading toward the IQ, the first in terms of mental age, this difference between chronological age, the actual number of years the person has been on the planet, and their mental age. And an individual in France who was a certain number of years behind in mental age, entering into school, let's say at 5 years old, but they're operating at, let's say, a 3-year-old, those individuals became eligible for special services. And the birthing of special education in the public school system, a very monumentous time. So very, very interesting developments here. Just as a little caveat, right around this time is the work of Maria Montessori, who was an individual who was tasked with working with individuals who did not make the cut into regular schools because of their mental age, and she developed all that mechanism of Montessori teaching was sort of motivated by this as well. Just a little caveat about, some of the things that were going on in the globe at that time. We had this emerging of mental age. We had the French government saying, okay, if individuals are a certain amount of time, certain amount of years behind, that is the eligibility for special services or special education. And those methodologies that were used to either remediate or to simply allow to teach that person the maximum amount of things that they can, evolved in some of the special techniques that we now recognize, Montessori teaching and special education techniques that we have today. Now, of course, the story doesn't end there, and I've been throwing the word IQ in there, but that IQ doesn't come along until the introduction of Lewis Terman. Now, Lewis Terman was a psychologist at Stanford University in the United States, and he traveled to France in order to encounter Binet's test. And he thought, this is really cool. He took the test. I don't think he stole it, but he got the test and he brought it back to the United States. And he said, let's do a little bit of math. If we're going to compare, if we're going to look at somebody and we're going to say they have a mental age, let's say of 2, and they have a chronological age of 5, how can we compute a number that relates to the relationship between their mental age and chronological age? So he decided he would have a fraction. Or another name for a fraction is a quotient. And you know where we're going with this. So we have mental age divided by chronological age. And then in order to remove any decimals, in order to make it whole numbers, so it's not like 12.6 or something like that, to remove the decimals, multiply by 100, and he invented the intelligent quotient, which is the relationship between mental age and chronological age. Now, in this particular instance, if a person has a mental age of 2 years and a chronological age of 5 years, and you do the math, the person's, it's going to be 2 divided by 5 gives you 0.4 times 140. They would have a 40 IQ. Now, if a person scored exactly the way they should, say this person, they're 5 years old, and they perform just like a 5-year-old. Then it'd be 5 divided by 5, 1 times 100, 100. And that's why the average intelligence of a given age group is always 100, because it's not a raw score. It's the ratio between mental age and chronological age. It's that fraction. And when it's 1 to 1, when there's the relationship between mental age and chronological age is exact, it's a 1 to 1 relationship. 1 divided by 1 times 100 is 100. So everybody's average IQ, all age average IQs are 100 by definition. Now, Terman then developed the Stanford-Binet intelligence test. Now, I think it's just cool to note that he didn't call it the Lewis-Terman test. He kept Binet's name, giving his friend and colleague the credit for creating this test. And the Stanford-Binet intelligence test, which measures mental abilities and produces what we now know as the IQ, or the intelligent quotient, the ratio of a person's mental age to their chronological age, is still in existence today. This is probably one of the most widely used intelligence tests. There's the Wechsler test is also very popular, and there's a few others, but the Stanford-Binet test is still one of the leading ones in terms of delivering a valid IQ. And we'll get a little bit into that in the next video. Now, there was a problem, however. Mr. Terman was, in fact, a fan of eugenics. Now, I want you to think back to Francis Galton, great mind, Darwin's cousin. We talked about him in the last video, but this was the individual who really got into that notion of the mental abilities were selected traits that allowed human beings as a species to progress and survive. And eugenics was the notion that if we were careful about who was allowed to actually have children, getting into the idea of selective breeding and whatnot, that whole thing, that eventually led to ideas such as the final solution for the Nazis, getting rid of the unwanted individuals because it was just moving, from that perspective, moving the species forward, ideas that are offensive to us now. But at that time, we're looking at Lewis Terman is a fan of eugenics, and he now has this tool that he used to determine who was feeble-minded. Now, individuals that were feeble-minded and we're going to see in some of the terms that were used, were individuals that were largely institutionalized, and because of the policy of eugenics and this tool that was now able to categorize these individuals, policies were created for castration, sterilization, and whatnot of these individuals while they're in institutions. These are horrors of the institutional world at the beginning of the 1900s. And straight until actually into the 1970s, some of these policies were still in place. All eugenically based, all based on IQ tests, and if an individual was feeble-minded enough, essentially the policy was we don't want that gene pool, we don't want that collection of genes to infect the gene pool, so let's make sure they don't have children. This is very, very hard things to hear with otherwise very intelligent people coming up with these ideas that they consider solutions to the problem. Now, as we saw in the title of this actual video, I introduced the terms idiot, imbecile, and moron. Now, these were terms that were attached to mental ages associated with Lewis Terman's intelligence test. So if we take a look at how these were defined, now, I'm sorry, I forgot about this slide. Alfred Binet, I will say, upon hearing about the U.S. application of his test, was very angry about that. He believed that the test had limitations and that the test could not be generalized the way they were doing it. And he was not in favor of his work being used in this way to identify feeble-minded individuals. So he was not on board with this. This was a decidedly Stanford and Lewis Terman idea. So we have these terms that start to appear in the clinical record. So the first one we have is the term idiot. Now, the technical use of that word was these are individuals that were so defective, these are quotes, that the mental development never exceeds that of a normal child of about 2 years old. So the individual never gets higher than a 2-year-old's mental age. Imbeciles were individuals that had a higher development than an idiot, but did not exceed that of a 7-year-old. And finally, we have morons who higher development than an imbecile, but does not exceed that of a normal 12-year-old. Now, we need to understand that the origin of some of these words, when these began to appear, they didn't have the sort of pejorative, negative connotation that we use them today. In fact, that sort of grew out of this. You know, if we referred to someone outside of the clinic as an idiot, it was really saying, well, you have the brain power of a 2-year-old, you know, kind of thing. There was that connection to this clinical world. Now, I say that, however, despite the fact that in truth, these words in their origins, when we look at where does the word idiot first appear, where does the word imbecile first appear, and moron, these words have always indicated levels of intelligence. They have not always been used clinically, and they have not always been used pejoratively to give somebody an insult, but they did have origins of meaning that relate to a person's mental abilities. So if we look at each one of these, idiot, the word idiot appeared first, as far as the record is concerned, in the 14th century. It's the oldest of all of these. It refers to individuals who are ignorant, the jester character, the fool character, and actually the word stimpy, which we get, you know, the modern day Ren and Stimpy cartoon. That word stimpy is that reference to the term idiot. Now, I always like to point out at this point too, for a while I was in school, I studied Shakespeare, and primarily the comedies and the tragedies. And in many of Shakespeare's work, in much of Shakespeare's work, there is the appearance of a jester type character. And this was an individual who was part of the court, the royal court, and in reality, the jester of history was an individual most likely with mental disabilities of some kind. And their kind of behaviors and their talking and whatnot was considered humorous, and these individuals were given jobs in order to entertain guests with their foolish mumblings and their actions and making them do things and all this. It's a very, very kind of nasty piece of history there. The interesting thing about the character of the fool or the jester that we see in Shakespearean work is that, in fact, he assigned that character the highest role in intelligence. And so we often see, and there was a reason for this, we often see, let's say, the character of the jester or the fool within a Shakespearean work. They turn to the audience, and they're the ones that are really understanding what's going on. There's some sort of turmoil, someone's cheating on somebody, you know, there's some sort of mess going on, and the jester or the fool has the insight and delivers that to the audience. So the audience becomes aware that there's this jester character that understands what's going on, and they're making fun of the royalty. And this was definitively the purpose of that particular literary tool, where Shakespeare would make what was commonly known as the most unintelligent individual in the room at least more intelligent than all the aristocracy. So he was making a political comment at the same time within the context of that era. When we watch Shakespeare today, we don't experience the jester or the fool as an individual that we would just naturally assume have mental disabilities. But in the day, that was a very, very important comedy part or commentary part of Shakespeare's work. So just a kind of some history in there about where we see the use of the word idiot. Now the next one here that I have, in the 16th century, we see imbecile. And this is where we see that feeble, weak-minded sort of characteristics. It's always meant that, so it was a convenient word for them to assign for individuals that never functioned above a 7-year-old. And finally, we see the individual, the word moron, foolish or stupid. And look at this, it's the same origin as the word sophomore. So the more on the end of it. So an individual who was a sophomore was considered, they just don't understand what's going on. You know, there's freshmen and then sophomores. Sophomores that you've been here long enough to understand, but you don't. And it's so sophomores actually has its history as a pretty pejorative term. So here we have this, at this point in our understanding of intelligence, we have the introduction of mental age, and then how Lewis Terman turned that into our modern concept of the IQ, or the intelligent quotient, which is a ratio of the mental age to chronological age, allows us to give a non-decimal number to describe how intelligent someone is related to their same age peers. Not to other people. It's always related to their chronological age. So that individual who had a mental age of 2, but they were actually 5 years old, they have an IQ of 40, which is a considerably low IQ related to other 5-year-olds. Okay? They would have an IQ of 100 related to, if there were 2. They'd have a 1-to-1. So just understanding that that means a ratio. And then we see some of the terms that were used and how those have a history of being descriptive of mental abilities in the more ancient world. They became clinical definitions of different levels of mental capacity in the kind of scary and frustrating and certainly not a proud moment in our history of eugenics and the kind of categorizing that was going on in institutions. And then in the modern day, the use of the word idiot, imbecile, and moron have nothing to do with actual testings or ability. They just become part of our slang vernacular. So we had part 2. So part 3, we're going to look a little bit at the uses of the IQ, why it's still important, all the different kinds of IQ tests we are, and then the sudden realization in psychology that one score is not enough. And we'll be leading through the applications of IQ into the emerging world that we now know of as multiple intelligences. So until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe. Hope you're on the edge of your seat for the next videos, and I will see you then.